That's great. Well, I think you're all there. Who is that philosopher? Is that Descartes who says, I think, therefore I am? I know I'm here and I see you all virtually. So that's interesting and fun. And I hope things are going well for you in your classes or whatever else you're doing during this fun pandemic time. So, how about we just get down to it? I'm going to talk a little bit tonight about opera in general, and then I'm going to talk some about Carmen and the project that we're doing here. It's not often that I get to do a deep dive into a topic with so many people. Usually, the classes that I teach at the college are, very well, a mile wide and an inch deep. It seems we have to cover lots of material in the introductory classes, but we have an opportunity here for this, and so I think this will be a lot of fun for you. Carmen is a great opera, and if you've never listened to an opera before, this will be a perfect introduction to that. How many people, can I just see hands or thumbs up, have never, ever seen or heard an opera before? Yeah, most of you probably. Yeah, okay. Good. Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about some of the parts of that. And I guess I should ask, how many people have seen an opera before? Let's just see hands for that. I'd like to see that. That's good. And how many people have played an opera? I think some of you have played. I see Yuri and Victoria here who played in the, is it Dnepropetrovsk Opera Theater, and probably played Carmen about 75 times, I imagine, in your time there in Ukraine. Okay. I'm going to see if I can do a little screen share here. So first, I want to talk with you tonight about the libretto, and in this particular case. So we can see here we have libra, the root word for libretto, right? Book. In a musical, the text for the musical is called the book. In an opera, libretto is the text for the opera. It's the storyline, and it's actually all of the dialogue and everything that is happening in the opera. People will buy librettos actually if they're going to operas, and they'll read through them, and they're usually printed in the language of the opera with a translation. You can buy them with a translation for English, in fact. So if that's something that you'd like to do, and this is a really cool one for Carmen. I found this one online today. So librettos originally were kind of around the ideas of Greek tragedies. And eventually we see the libretto starting to become more and more realistic around stories that are more realistic. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that influences opera later on, because our original operas were in the early 17th century, our public ones. And so there was quite a bit of transition by the time we get into the 19th century and when Carmen was written. All right, so the pieces of the opera, because the structure, particularly in the beginning, was very similar. We have something called the aria. The aria was the solo song that everybody wanted to hear, and they would come to hear that. And usually the aria occurred in the beginning in a pattern of A B. We have the libretto, the storyline for the opera. We have the aria and an A B pattern in the beginning, and then ABA later on, with the last section, the A section, repeated so that the performers could improvise over it and add ornamentation. And they would add ornamentation so that they could show off, and particularly when public opera came about, they would be able to, get the next gig because they could show that they were the better singer. And so it eventually evolves into that. In fact, in contracts for early opera stars, it was standard that they had to have at least 5 arias assigned to each of the principal characters so that they could show off what they could do. All right, so that's the aria. And then we have the recitative. The recitative is spoken singing. Some of you might have seen the musical Hamilton. In Hamilton, there are a lot of recitative quality type things going on. In musicals, you'll have everything stop, like a Broadway musical, and there'll be actual dialogue. In a recitative and opera, most of the time, this is accompanied, and it's accompanied by sparsely by just a couple of instruments, and maybe an early opera would have been just like a guitar type instrument like the lute or the harpsichord or something of that sort. The recitative, and look at that root word there, recite, that's just that's meant to advance the action. The recitative tells the story, and the solo songs are thrown in there as the popular songs that people really wanted to come and hear. All right, so those are the first few parts. Let's see here if I can get to my next one. Okay. So besides the solo arias and the recitatives, we have ensembles. And ensembles can be duets, particularly between the lovers in the opera, or it can be trios or quartets. They're actually in Carmen's several really great ensemble pieces, particularly when we talk about the smugglers and the smugglers in the tavern and all of that. There's some really nice things that are written for that. And then we have the chorus. Choruses. Let's see here. Here's an example of soldiers in a chorus behind Carmen, right? All singing. And in fact, in Carmen, the chorus, when it first came out, went on strike because the show asked for the chorus to dance while they were singing. It was the first time that kind of thing had happened, and they weren't happy about it at all. So in the chorus, we could have soldiers or townspeople or children's choruses that are around. Here's another. It's an updated Carmen here, right? And then we have instrumental interludes. And let's see, I can pull these things around. Yeah. There we go. There's a full opera orchestra. And with a full opera orchestra, you can see they're huge. And a lot of times in modern opera, the opera orchestra will not only be in the pit in front of the stage, but will also extend underneath the stage. In this particular setting, they're not, but we see that quite a bit. And in early opera, it would be just a few players, and they would actually just sit on stage with the instrument, with the singers, and play. And there's an example. This is a lute right here. A lute is a predecessor to our modern guitar, and it's a pretty light sounding instrument. This little Rosetta here is carved into the face of the lute, but it's not hollowed out like a guitar, and so you don't get the same amplification that you do in that instrument. All right, a couple of more things. Eventually, particularly in French opera, they began to require that the ballet be part of the opera. It was insisted upon by the aristocracy. Ballet was a dance that started in French courts, and then it wound up being part of opera. And we'll see some dancing in Carmen as well. There'll be parts where there are dancing in the entr'actes for the ballet, and in the tavern with the gypsies dancing there as well. And then another big player in opera is where it's performed. And the hall. This is the Metropolitan Opera in New York. It's the most well-known opera theater in the United States. There are probably three major well-known companies in the United States: the San Francisco Opera, the Chicago Lyric, and the Metropolitan Opera. But there are lots of other ones that are important as well, like Seattle here on the West Coast, and Los Angeles, and Houston, and the National Opera in Washington, D.C., and so on. But going to the Met is a really incredible experience. You can see how it's shaped here with the box seats, and then the seats here that are on the floor level, and then you can see the orchestra that's here in the pit and the stage there. Yeah. Okay. And this is the Teatro. Let's see if I can get out of that. Teatro San Cassiano. This was the first public opera theater in Venice in 1637. And so opera was something that was part of the court life and part of the aristocracy for a long time until we get to Venice. And Venice had a burgeoning middle class. Venice was a pretty wild and rollicking town in the 17th century. And the middle class had money for entertainment, which was not the case in most places in Europe at that time. And so we see the building of our first public opera house. And by the time we hit the 18th century, Venice has 10 full-time opera houses operating. It was the home of opera, really. And compare that to a city like London, which was much larger and much more cosmopolitan, only 5 there. And so Venice really loved its opera, and Italian opera became the standard. Everybody wanted to have opera like the Italians did. No? Okay. So get out of that for a minute. Let's talk about vocal types. The soprano. The soprano is the highest of the female voices, and there are all kinds of different qualities to the soprano voice. And they have different titles. There are titles like coloratura and spento, and these have different characteristics. And we actually have a soloist coming in to talk with us about that a little bit. But these different vocal types, the high female voice, also took on certain kinds of characteristics in opera. And so the soprano many times would play a character that was the love interest, or love interest, there we go, better, and or pure virginal, naive, all typical qualities of the soprano voice, the high female voice in opera of the time. The mezzo soprano is a lower female voice and classification. Some relate it to the alto voice if you've sung in choir, but in opera we call the lower female voice the mezzo soprano. The mezzo soprano would take on the roles oftentimes of a mother or a friend, wisdom. Usually was not the star, sometimes could be evil. So we will see that with the mezzo soprano. And we have the tenor. The tenor was the high male voice, is the high male voice in opera. And the tenor is similar to the soprano. Usually the love interest in the story. And the tenor would usually be somewhat naive, heroic, pure is good, virile. Those are the kinds of, adjectives that you might use for a tenor and the character that they play. And the baritone. Baritone is a little bit lower than the tenor. The baritone is a male voice, and that male voice of the baritone would usually play characteristics of a friend, a supporting character of some kind, maybe a father figure in some, and could be a heroic figure. Also could be someone who's sort of conniving behind the scenes. The baritone was pretty flexible kind of role in that case. Whoops. And then we have the bass. So the bass was the lowest of the voices, and lowest male voice. The bass would take on the voice of God, wisdom. It would be a father figure, sometimes evil, depending on the show, sometimes a buffoon, a comic figure. Also, the baritone would do that. And so these characters would all stay similar in the opera. Usually the best arias, the best solo songs would go to the soprano and the tenor in that order. Yeah. And the bass and the baritone and the mezzo would have to fight over a few others in the case of that. There's one other that I didn't mention here that was important in early Baroque opera and well into the even into the early 20th century, and that was the castrati singers. In Venice, which was fairly forward thinking, and in London, which was also after Shakespeare's time pretty progressive, women could appear on stage, and so women sung the roles of the soprano and the mezzo soprano parts. But in places that were more conservative, particularly the Papal States around Rome, the men had to play those parts, so the female parts, and the castrati played quite a few of those. And these were young boys, grown men, but as boys had been castrated, so their voice didn't change with puberty. Sound like a lot to give up for your craft, gentlemen? So if you're, particularly if your family was not too wealthy and you had a son who was showed some promise in the music industry, and because opera had taken off so well, you might consent to such an operation. The castrati were incredibly famous and made tons of money and enjoyed, enjoyed a certain amount of privilege in their life, except for the difficulties they undergo and they underwent in their younger years, I suppose. So those are our vocalists and our vocal types. And so what would you have heard then? I'm going to get into a new one here. So what would we have seen then if we went to an early opera? Let's see if I can do this with a mouse. So in those early opera houses, we would see a setup, a kind of like a horseshoe theater. It looked like this. I'm going to draw here in my very bad handwriting. And that's kind of an aerial view. And let's say this is our stage area here, more or less. So we had an area down here that was called the pit. This whole area was pit. And in some of the early houses, this was just a dirt floor, or it might have been straw down there, or and later on we start to get some benches, long benches, and then eventually, like we saw with the Met, we saw the chairs, that were all put into that area, right? And then eventually too, there'll be this area here in front of the stage where the orchestra sits, but not in early Baroque opera. In early opera, you would have people that would just come and sit usually on the floor. You could bring a blanket, you could bring a picnic basket, and you bring your wine, your baguette, or in some places they would sell food. They would sell oranges between the acts, or they would sell coffees actually, and other things to eat and all of that. And you would sit down here and you would enjoy the opera. You might sit on your with your friends and hang out and watch that. And up here in the box seats is where the wealthy, the aristocracy, usually the same, but not always, because there are business classes that were going in Venice, would sit up here. In these boxes, there were all kinds of things that were going on other than opera attendance and paying attention. There was lots of conversation, and usually there was some balcony area outside. You could step out of the boxes and walk over to your friends over here and talk with them. Lots of gambling going on. That was a big part of the opera. So you can come and do all of that. Um, there were curtains on some of the boxes in some of the theaters. And so, lovers would be up here in the box and they would close the curtains, and that would be a lot of fun for the people down in the pit. And they go, oh, wonder what they're doing up there. And, so it was quite an event, more like a rock concert in a lot of ways than anything else. Um, People in a pit on the pit side were allowed to wear hats because people in the box seats liked for the fun to spit down upon them, and so you had that going on as well. And the opera would start usually with some kind of instrumental introduction. Later on, we get to something called the overture. The overture would contain themes and music that was already in the opera and sort of put together in a pastiche for the clientele to hear. But in the early opera, it was just some kind of getting ready music to go. And there might be 6 players here sitting on stage. They weren't sitting yet down in the pit area and playing instruments like maybe a lute, maybe a cello type instrument or a viol, maybe a harpsichord, maybe violins or something similar to that. And they again reside on the stage. And so the opera might start off with, let's say we have an old man who comes to tell us a story about the opera. And he's telling this with a little recitative accompanied just by a cello and a lute over here. And he tells us a story about these star-crossed lovers, and nobody's really paying attention or gambling or talking or eating and having a great time because nobody really listened to the recitatives because the operas didn't make any sense in the beginning anyway. And then, here comes the soprano. And she's going to sing us a beautiful song about how lovely flowers are in the springtime. And she finishes her song and she sings in an ABA pattern and actually wows the house, and everybody is stopped. It's silent and they listen to her, and now they can't control themselves. They're yelling, and what are they yelling? They're yelling brava. And they're yelling, I love you up here. And this one, it hurts so much. I think I'll have to jump. Really, they did say things like that. Back here in the back was a platform, a wooden platform in a lot of these houses. And the gondoliers, were in Venice. So the gondoliers, who were a treasure of the city, would be allowed to come to the opera theater for free. And it eventually dawned on the singers that they could exploit that. And so they started to have a bit of an entourage of different groups of gondoliers. And they would wear these big, heavy, thick boots, right? And they would stand on the platform in the back. And then if their singer came out, they would stomp on the platform, getting the crowd all riled up, and everybody's going. So anyway, you had all that going on. Well, soprano was finished. They loved her so much, they made her sing the aria 3 times, which was common. They wouldn't let you go on with the show until you sang it again and again and again because there was no recordings. And so if you wanted to be able to sing that song later on, you really need to get it in your ear, right? All right, now the hero comes tripping out. Here's our hero. He's a tenor. He's got a ball cap and a scruffy beard and Doc Martens. He's a hipster, but he's a really great singer. And he starts with some recitative, and it's truly wretched. And he then goes into his aria, and he misses a bunch of lines, and he gets lost in the music, and his Zoom doesn't work, and all of that kind of stuff. And the audience out here, oh, what do we hear? we hear boos, lots of them. And then what happens? Lots of things coming up on the stage. Baguettes, maybe a wine bottle if you have a particularly vicious crowd, the orange merely misses his head. And so he has to get off stage as soon as he can. Right. And then the chorus comes out. Maybe we have some soldiers that are singing or some townspeople and all of that. And, up here, nobody's really paying attention to any of that until the aria comes back and maybe the singer they liked, and they all go home happy, kind of drunk and probably lost some money and all of that. And it was an evening at the opera. Sounds very much different than the kind of opera that we think about today, where you have to go and sit very quietly and make sure that you don't make any noise. It was, like I said, again, more like a rock concert than anything else. Okay. So let me get out of this and let's talk about Carmen a little bit. So Carmen is an opera that was written and premiered in 1875. So it's a late 19th century. It's a French opera written by Georges Bizet, and so the opera is in French, which is, Italian was the language for opera until we hit about Mozart's time, and then there's this big tug of war about, whose language is going to be used for opera, and why do we always have to use the Italians? And then we start to get somewhat of a nationalistic school in these different places. The Germans have their opera and their way of doing things, and the French have their way of doing things, and Russian opera becomes huge, and English opera becomes big, and we have all of these pockets, and they reflect the culture and the traditions of those areas, not only in stories and all of that, but also in how they're organized. And Carmen is no different. Carmen, we just talked about the how the organization of the opera was. Carmen starts to work more toward what they call the Verismo style. In fact, they kind of think of Carmen in a lot of ways as being the first one to be in a very realistic style. And so you don't have things stopping and starting. Here's a recitative, now here's an aria, now here's a chorus, now here's a dance, and these kinds of things. But it's instead a very stream of consciousness way of working, and the music doesn't stop, and the themes are feel like they're real life kinds of themes, not too extravagant. And so we have Carmen and this composer and this libretto, and it is French. And probably if we thought today about any opera that could just transition into being a popular public kind of event in popular culture, Carmen would be the one. It has all of those things in it, those elements, that go against the highbrow image of opera. Right? And a lot of the guilty pleasures. It has sensuality and sexuality. It has murder. It has, there's a very strong storyline. It has great music. It has the idea of the femme fatale in it, which is a trope that we see a lot in different kinds of stories. And so that's what we have. All right. So the story of Carmen is set in Seville, Spain, in about 1830. It's set in a town center with a garrison with soldiers and a cigarette factory, right? And so in the beginning of it, we have soldiers that have kind of gathered outside this cigarette factory, and they're waiting for the factory girls to appear because they're sitting around watching girls go by. And as they're doing that, a young woman arrives, and her name is Michaela. And Michaela is a soprano. So we know about sopranos. They're pure and virtuous. And, Michaela is all of that in spades. She's from the village. And, she's just been at church. And she's just shown up here. And the soldiers are all, acting like they haven't seen a woman in 3 years, and they're leering at her and kind of, and she says, well, I'm here to meet Don Jose. I need to meet him and talk with him. And they said, well, he's not working right now. He's on the next, he'll be at the change of the guard. But they said, but you can stick around with us. And she says, no, I think I'll go get a pumpkin spice latte and come back. And so she takes off. And then we have the soldiers all sitting around, and then eventually the change of the guard happens. So we have Lieutenant Zuniga, who is leading the guard. Zuniga is a base. So we know about base, right? Base can be an authority figure, right? And they can be kind of evil or wise. In this case, Zuniga is, yeah, kind of evil. But Zuniga comes marching along, and following him is Don Jose. And Don Jose is our tenor, our hero, right? Our, well, somewhat of a hero, and he will be the love interest of Carmen when we meet her. And so they are all soon they're all there, and soon the women emerge from the cigarette factory to take a break, and they all start to sing, you know, "Come out, Carmen," because they're all waiting for Carmen. Carmen is a gypsy. A word about the term gypsy, the for some that's a pejorative term. In the opera, that is the term that they use. Roma is the word we use today in the United States. In Europe, it's Romani, and it's meant for the peoples that were from northwestern India who migrated into southern Europe and so on. And there were some stereotypes about them. And so some Roma today still hold the term gypsy as a descriptive term for them. So as in anything, it depends on your audience and on what you're talking about. But just so you know that. So we have then the women have emerged from their break. Here comes Carmen, and Carmen is going to work the room. She is the antithesis of Michaela, right? She's a mezzo soprano. She's wise. Nobody's going to get over on her, and she's boldly flirting with every man there, and particularly she notices who? Don Jose. Don Jose has no interest in her at all. It doesn't seem he's not paying any attention to her. And that is the reason that she goes right for him. She flirts boldly with him and throws a flower at his feet. And then eventually the women have to go back to work, but Don Jose keeps the flower. Yeah. Okay. So Don Jose then has this flower, and we have heard Carmen sing this very same famous song, the Habanera, Havana song, and it's in two. And I'm running out of time. I won't play that for you here tonight, but it comes up right at the beginning of the opera, and she talks about how love is a rebellious bird, and that nothing will contain her and tell her who she's going to love and what she's going to do, and she may love many men if she wants to. Well, now 19th century French society was very Victorian and very, very conservative in their values. In fact, when this opera came out, it was scandalous, right? Like, oh man, that's the worst thing. And the critics panned it until Bizet, the composer, died after about 30 shows. And then they decided, oh, this is the greatest. During his lifetime, he didn't know. But we got to go see it. And of course, calling it scandalous meant everybody wanted to go see it. Put a lot of butts in seats, right? Or you put some sex in there and some murder, and everybody wanted to see it, even though the critics said. And then they decided it was this incredible opera, and it goes right here in the very beginning with the way Carmen is presented. All right, so Michaela comes back. She now finds Don Jose. And she has a letter from his mother. They have just gone to church together, she and the mother. And she has a letter for Don Jose. And we find out that Michaela, who was an orphan that his mother was taking care of, the mother has written a letter and tells Don Jose that, hey, I think Michaela would make a good wife for you. And Jose seems like he likes that. And there's a little kissy and, a little flirt, not like Carmen, which is very overt, but, a kind of kiss on the cheek. And then eventually she takes off. Then there's a commotion. The cigarette girls now have had a big fight, and one of them has slashed the other in the face with a knife. It ends up that Carmen is the one that has done this, and the soldiers bring them both in, and we'll see the chorus of all of the women from the cigarette factory singing and taking sides, and we'll hear the woman who has her face as damaged. She's saying, oh man, Carmen called me this and that, and then she says, Carmen, you're a mule's ass, is what she says. And Carmen says, well, if I'm a mule's ass, you can walk behind me and wipe off the flies, right? And then they start to argue again, and we have all of that going on. So Carmen is tough, and so, well, they decide that they're going to arrest Carmen. So Zuniga, the base, the uh, the captain there, decides to go off and do some paperwork. He tells Don Jose, arrest her, put her in prison. Yeah, well, this is when they Carmen sings the Sigadiga to him. This little song about how she'd like to meet him at an inn later on, maybe under the cover of darkness, and they can have a little liaison. And wouldn't you like that? And eventually, and she thinks maybe she's in love with him, and eventually Don Jose can't resist, and he lets her go. He lets her escape. And at the end of Act One, they've arrested Don Jose, and he's off on his way to prison. So there we go. That's how it's set up. So we get to Act Two. We're in a tavern there. Carmen is there with some of her friends, and they're drinking with the soldiers. The lieutenant is there, Zuniga. We don't know why Carmen was never arrested, but she wasn't, and so she's hanging out in the tavern. It's 2 months later, and now we have Don Jose. We hear that he's all been released from prison, and he's still, for some reason, a soldier. And so they invite, they say that he might be coming down to the tavern later on. There are some smugglers in the tavern too, and they try to entice Carmen to go with them and some friends, and they're going to go on this thing where they're going to smuggle a bunch of stuff and steal a bunch of stuff. And she says, no, I can't go because I'm in love. And so she stays there in the tavern. And then we have the arrival of the toreador, the bullfighter, another tenor. This is Escamillo. And Escamillo comes in with as much machismo as you can possibly see. And he's talking about, how wonderful I am. And he immediately eyes Carmen. He thinks, well, maybe I can get, Carmen. And she says, no, I'm not interested in you. I am in love with this other man, right? And so eventually, Don Jose shows up. So Don Jose is there, and she asks him to go with her and go with the smugglers up into the mountains and be part of their group. He says, "Well, no, I can't do that. I'm a soldier, and I've got to go back to work and all this kind of stuff." And she gets very angry with him. And then he sings this beautiful aria to her, the Flower Song, and she tries to kind of forgive him, but she doesn't really. And then Zuniga shows up again, his superior officer, and he tells Don Jose, leave the room. I want Carmen now. And they get into a big fight, and finally he gets the better of Don Jose. Gets the better of Zuniga, and now he has to leave. He can never go back to be a soldier. His life is falling apart. And so now we have Don Jose traveling with Carmen and her friends and the smugglers up into the mountains. His life completely in ruins from what he had it before. In Act 3, they are up in the mountains planning the little smuggling trip they're going to do, and the gypsies start to read cards, and they get to Carmen, and Carmen's card says that she is going to die soon, and that also Don Jose will die. And so we have that. And she says, it doesn't matter how many times you do the cards. Once you get a death card, you're going to die. And so eventually the smugglers decide to go off on their job. Don Jose stays behind the encampment to keep guard. Michaela shows up again, interestingly. And she's frightened by the mountains. And she's afraid to meet Carmen, who's turned her the love interest into a criminal, and then Don Jose is trying to settle her down, and then he sees a movement in the darkness, and he fires his gun, and find out that's Escamillo. Well, Escamillo's just shown up because he's heard a rumor that maybe Carmen's looking for a new lover. So he thinks, hey, here I am. Maybe that could work out for me. And Carmen says, well, maybe, but Jose and he get into a fight, and then Finally, the smugglers come back and separate the both of them. And as he leaves, Escamilla says, "Hey, you know what, Carmen, I have a bullfight coming up. Why don't you come to that? All you guys can come to it, especially you." All right. Michaela emerges one more time. This is the third time. The knock on the door, the knock on the door of come back to your life, right? And she begs Jose to come home. She says, "Your mother wants you to come home." And Jose is determined to stay with Carmen, which Carmen says, "I'm kind of done with you. I'm tired of you." And then Michaela says, "Your mother is dying. Please come home." And so he leaves. But as he's leaving with Michaela, he threatens Carmen. And so finally we get to Act 4. Act 4 takes place at a bullfight in Seville. And we see Escamillo, the bullfighter, comes walking in with this big entourage, and there on his arms, Carmen. You know? And she tells him she's never loved a man as much as she loves Escamillo, the bullfighter, and she will until she dies. So Escamilla goes in to the arena, and Carmen stays outside. And her friends come out. They say, we saw Don Jose. He's in the crowd. I think you better leave. I beg you to leave. And well, Carmen says, I don't. I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay right here. And so Don Jose comes and he finds her. And he begs Carmen, he says, "Forget the past, start a new life with me." And she calmly tells him, "It's over." And he begs her again, and he's a bit violent about it. She says, "I'm with Escamillo now. I'm not, uh, I am not going to go with you." And she turns and starts to enter the bull ring. Jose grabs her, and she looks at him, and the ring that he had given her, she tears off her finger, and she throws it at his feet. In a rage, Jose draws a knife and stabs her and kills her. And just at that moment, Escamillo has finished the fight. There's a roar in the arena. He walks out and he sees Don Jose standing over Carmen with the bloody knife in his hand. And the police take him away. And that is the end of the opera. Ah, a tragedy all around. Yes? Oh, okay. Well, the stories of opera, particularly ones that continue to hold our interest, are stories that describe experiences that we can identify with, right? They're kind of about our own encounters with the truth in some way. And Carmen is, no exception to that. It is the number 3 performed opera of all time, and the number 1 performed opera in France. And it, really is a reflection of a lot of truths. And, maybe you've been in a toxic relationship, yourself, or maybe you know someone who has, or maybe you've been dumped, or maybe you've dumped someone, right? The thing about Carmen that's kind of cool is that, you can sympathize with both the dumper and the dumpee. You can see how that all has characterized itself. The character Carmen wants and needs some freedom, and she wants to love as many men as she likes, and she has no use for this moral culture, right? And what Don Jose needs is the structure, right? He wants Carmen to settle down with him. He's a soldier, and he embodies the status quo and what that's all about. And so when we look at the character of Carmen, we have to think about what Carmen is representing. Is she somewhat of a feminist icon, right? Is with her own strength and conviction and vigor, and she's going to go her own way regardless of what anyone tells her. And she'll control a room, right? She has no use for a stereotype, typical female, and in fact finds that repulsive. And her power and enjoyment is in manipulation of men and women. You can see that part of Carmen. But the other one that is often accused of in the Carmen story is that Carmen is a manifestation of the male fantasy of the seductress, right? And with a bit of, appropriation of what the French thought the gypsies, the Roma were all about, and that they were so exotic. She's wild and she's promiscuous and maybe a bit debauched. And what can a poor soldier like Don Jose do. Convenient, for him to say it's not his fault. So, here's a quote from a professor at Yale who says, Carmen is the lusty, bitchy beauty who will destroy men and must therefore be destroyed. She represents male fantasies and fears. So that's one take on her. And then on Don Jose, here's another one. With his mother issues and his jealousy, nothing enrages an unstable dude more keenly than mockery. And Carmen is mocking him all the time. And Carmen leaves Jose and laughs at him. As his world contracts, he ultimately appears exhausted, a husk of misplaced vengeance. If Carmen is a tragedy, it's a tragedy of hopelessly confused masculinity, right? So there we have a very interesting structure there. And we have this kind of idea of Don Jose being this everyman trying to deal with the femme fatale. Well, you can also zoom out in just a little bit of a wider view too, and realize that Carmen is a very, very old story and universal warning. The very human fear is the loss of your self-discipline and your inability to maintain that, and we all know about self-discipline, particularly in pandemic times. I have a box of chocolate chip cookies sitting on my kitchen counter right now that are calling to me. They sing to me and they say, you didn't have dinner tonight, and it would be very nice if you came and had one of us, and maybe you could have two because we're not as big as those big old Costco cookies, so that would be okay, right? And so why don't you, just a taste, it'll be all right. About self-discipline. Right? One of the oldest stories out there. It's part of our very DNA, and a good description of how we deal with structure and the structures we put in place. And so, granted, Carmen is a setting of that, and the male-female dynamic couched in the language and the interests and the social construct of the worldview of the 19th century. And fair enough, we may not agree with how all of that plays out through a 21st century lens, but we recognize it. And Carmen endures because, it's wrapped in a package of provocative and sensational and sensual and dramatic energy. And the music is just damn good. It's really, I can't wait for you to hear some of it if you haven't yet. So worthy of our examination and conversation on a lot of levels. I hope you'll enjoy, all of these lectures. And, we have some really great lectures coming up, truly world-class people coming in to talk with you about the opera. The opera is available in the Google Classroom here on our site to go and listen to if you want to listen to the whole thing. And also the libretto is there. And we're going to keep these all to an hour long for you. And you can enjoy them from your home in your pajamas with a cookie of your choice. And so when you go on Canvas, those of you who are in my classes, and it says, put in the code for into the box to get credit for tonight, you will type in these three words: chocolate chip cookie, and you will get credit for attending the lecture this evening. All right. Thank you, everyone. If you have any questions, I'm around, and see you next time, September 16th.
Just to double check, we just type in chocolate chip cookie into the submission box for this assignment?
That's correct.
Cool. Thank you so much. This was really cool.
Thank you.
Next time I would recommend Spanish white wine.
Yeah, I'll have to second that.